Hi everybody and welcome to section 6 of Access for ECDL, and in this section we're going to look at queries. We have 3 chapters left to do, and they are queries, forms and reports. So these are going to be 3 lengthy enough chapters, okay? These 3 chapters represent the other 3 objects in Access that we have to look at. We've already looked at tables, which is the most fundamental object in Access. That's what we put our data into, and now we're going to look at the second object, which are queries. So in this chapter, we're going to be doing a number of things. Queries are not difficult, but they can be fiddly, okay? But as long as you understand the nuts and bolts of what we're doing, you should be okay. And as always, just step through the video slowly. It's good to be able to have the video to go back through at least and replay it again and again in order to maybe cement some part of it that's causing trouble for you in your head. So in this section, we're going to look at, first of all, what a query is and why we might need them. We look at how to edit and create and delete queries. We look at how to use sort in a query. We've already looked at sorting and filtering, in fact, in the last chapter. So we look at how to use sort when we've got a query made and we've actually extracted data from a query. We're going to look at how to sort that. We already actually know how to do that, but we'll look at how to sort the results of a query. We look at how to print query records. We look at how to query related tables, and we've already looked at table relationships, and we'll see that queries can be very powerful because they can be used to query tables that are related to each other. We're also going to use specific criteria in queries, and we'll use queries to look for values in a certain range, let's say between two different numbers, okay? And we'll look at what are known as and or queries as well, and non-matches. So a lot of that sounds technical, but when you see it working in practice, it's actually not that difficult at all. So let's get started right away with actually what is a query. Okay, so with the introduction out of the way, we're now going to look at exactly what a query is and why we might need them, or what makes them useful. Queries are one of the four objects that we use in Access. We've already seen tables. Now we're going to move on to the second fundamental object in Access, which is a query. And a query is used to extract specific information from a database. All right, so if I open up the houses database here, just to give you an example, and open up the houses table within it, I've got 30 records in it, which to be honest is not that many. It's a small table. It's a small database. But you can imagine if I wanted to extract only certain records out of this. For instance, if I wanted to extract houses only from a certain town or a certain type of house, for instance, bungalows. We've already seen how we can do that using filters. We can filter out certain information in the table, and we can also have multiple levels of filter as well. And we could then save the filtered table. But the problem is then we would have to alter the filter if we wanted to, let's say, look for only a specific type of house, let's say with a certain number of bedrooms. We'd have to alter the existing filter. There's no way of having saved multiple filters on the table. Queries are much more flexible as a result, because what we can do with a query is we can create a query. For instance, we could query this table here to return only records of houses that have a garage. So for instance, wherever garage says yes. And we could then save that query, and the query would appear over here in our objects pane. We could give it a name, let's say query by house or whatever you want to call it. We could then run that query whenever we want to literally query the database on houses which have a garage. And the great thing about queries is that they're dynamic. If we added 50 more houses and a certain number of those had garages, we wouldn't need to update the query. It would always take the most recent up-to-date information from the table. So for that reason, and for more that we'll see as we go along, queries are very, very useful. Like filters, we can also have multiple levels of criteria in the query. So we could, in this example again, we could have a query that would return only houses from a certain town that were, let's say, within a certain price range and that had, let's say, solid fuel central heating. Okay, or solid fuel heating. Those are just 3 examples of 3 criteria I could apply to a query. I could then save that query. The query would appear over here. We'll see this in a few minutes when we start creating our own queries. And we could then run that query. That's the terminology we use. We say that we run a query. When we run a query, it literally queries the table that the query is based on, and it extracts the records that we've specified using whatever criteria. In this case, for instance, as I said, the town, the price range, and the type of heating. And we could then add 100 or 1,000, whatever number of houses you want to that record. And if we ran that query again, it would take into account the new records that were added. So queries are extremely powerful. In a nutshell, they allow us to extract a subset of certain information from a table, only specific records that we're interested in. But where they score, in one of the many ways they score over filters, although what they do is slightly similar, is that we can save individual queries and we will always have the most up-to-date information when we run that query. So hopefully now that you understand what exactly a query is, let's see how to actually query a table. We're going to create a query based on one of the databases that we have. So that's our next step. Okay, in this section we're actually going to create a query. We're going to query a table. The easiest way of learning how to make a query is simply to make a query. Before we do that, we have to open up a database that we can query, or to be more specific, a table within a database that we can query. So I'm going to go to File, and I'm going to look for a database called Mailing, or Mailing1 as I have it saved here. So I'm going to open up the mailing database. I'm not sure if we've looked at this mailing database before, but it's just a variation on a theme. It's got two tables in it, mailing and new mail, and a form, which we can ignore. So if I double left click on mailing to open it up, again, it's just a variation on a theme here. It's nothing that we haven't seen before. This is like a list of individuals maybe to whom that we send stuff out via a mailing list. So we're keeping basically information about each person in our mailing list in a table called mailing. What kind of information are we storing about them? Their name, their address, their town, and so on and so forth. This would not be a great way of storing people's names in the name column. They have their first and last name in there, which is not a great practice. But we're going to ignore that for now. Just know that normally you would have a first name field and a last name field. So we've got what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 different fields for each record or for each entry in the database. So I just wanted to give you a look at the mailing table so that you get an idea of what we're actually querying when we go to create the query. So I'll close that down. Okay, let's create the query. To do that, I left click on the Create tab, and you can see that there are various different groups for the 4 database objects: tables, queries, forms, and reports. I'm going to left click on Query Design. There are 2 ways of creating a query. Query Wizard, which is like that automated sequence of steps that you can go through, you know, where you keep clicking on next and next and next and then eventually finish. And you can also click on Previous in the wizard as well. It's like an automated, more user-friendly, admittedly, way of doing it, but it takes a lot of control away from you as well. We have a lot more granular control over our query when we go into query design. And you're also going to need to know it for the exam as well. So I'm going to left click once on Query Design, and we get up the following. We have a new query opened up, which is not saved yet, but we can see it here. Its tab is opened here. And there is a Show Table dialog box. And this shows the list of available tables that we can query in this database. We're going to select Mailing. It's probably selected for you automatically. Then I'm going to click the Add button, and the fields from the mailing table are displayed here in this field list. So I can now close down the Show Table box. All right, so now we have our list of fields here, and down here we have what's known as the query grid. This shows the fields that are going to be included in the output when we actually run our query. We don't have to include every single field. See the way I can just make the field list a bit bigger there by clicking in the corner and dragging it down. But we don't have to left click on or include every single one of these fields in the query grid. We're going to move some of them down. All right. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to include the name. And I'm going to show you 2 ways that you can include a field from the field list in your query grid down here. I can either left click on the field in particular and drag it down onto the first available column. That's one way of doing it. Okay, I'm going to undo that and show it to you again. Left click once on name, hold your mouse button down, and drag the mouse down until it's over the field row down here in the query grid, and then release. That's one way of doing it. And undo that. Second way of doing it is to simply double left click on the field list entry. In this case, the name field is what I want. So when I double left clicked on name, it was automatically included in the first available column. If I was to double left click on address 1, that would be put into the next column, address 3, address 2, town, and so on and so forth. Now I'm going to cut these out because I don't want them in. We'll be looking at that shortly, actually. But for now, I'm just going to cut everything out. And the only thing I wanted to include in this query when I run it are people's names. That's it. So how do we run a query? Well, we have to left click on the design tab, and you'll see a run button up in the results group when you're on the design tab. So let's left click on that and see what happens. That's it. We have a table. A table has been generated for us containing only people's names from, if I double left click on the mailing table to open it up, all of these people bar all of this information here. Okay, the only thing we've asked to include is the name, and that's what's in this query 1 window right here. So I'm going to go back to the design view. Remember when we were creating tables, we could create tables, or rather we had 2 views for tables. We had datasheet view and we had design view. It's the same for queries and forms and reports as well. I'm going to left click up here in the top left hand corner. You can ignore SQL view. We're just going to go back to design view, the design view for the query. And we're back to where we were a moment ago. So I can make some changes to this query now. Let's see, in the second field, what will we put in? Let's include the following. Let's double left click on department. I could also click on department and drag it down here. I find it quicker though, just to double left click. And now I'm going to run the query again. And this time it's going to include people's name, everybody's name from the database, and the department that they're in. Again, if I open up mailing, you'll see the department is one of the fields that's in the mailing table. So what I'm asking this query to do is I'm asking it to return every person in the database and the department they're in. And I don't want any other information, so I've cut out all of the other information. So creating a query is pretty straightforward. I'm going to do it from scratch quickly again. So I'm going to close this query down. It's asking me, do I want to save the changes? No, I don't. I'm going to click no. So from the top, if I click on create, if I go to query design, Access will always ask you which table do you want to base your query on. Let's base it again on the the mailing singular table. So I left click on add, and the field list, in other words, the list of fields that are in this table appear here in the field list box. And I can now close down the show table box. I can then make this a little bit bigger by clicking on the right hand corner. You can click on the edges as well. And now I want to include the fields that I want to appear when this query is run. So I can double left click, or I can drag down. So this time I'll include name, town, and let's go with organization this time. Now I want to run this query, so if you're not on the design tab, you won't see the run button. So you need to click on the design tab, and you'll see run up here in the top left hand corner in the results group. So we click on run, and that's it. It gives us every person that's in the database, their town and their organization. Because, and if I go back to design view by left clicking on view, and going back to design view, those are the only 3 fields that I specified that I wanted displayed in my query when I ran it. You need to make sure that the show box is ticked for each. They will be by default when you include these fields. But for instance, if I left click on the show box underneath organization and run the query again, I don't see it. So you can hide certain ones from view once you've included them. And there may be different reasons why you might want to do that. You might be thinking, well, why include it in the first place if you're going to hide it? But there can be different reasons why you might want to leave it in the query, but you might want to hide it temporarily for a certain run of the query. So that in a nutshell is how you create a query. Hopefully you found it okay. In the next section we're going to look at how to sort query results, which we kind of know how to do anyway because we've looked at sorting and filtering, but we'll look at how to sort the results of a query that are being displayed in a table. The very last note on this is that when you run a query, essentially a table is created, okay? A brand new table is created, and we can see this table here. We haven't saved this query yet. We're going to be doing this very, very shortly. So when I click on the X here, it says you want to save the changes to the design of query one. If I click no, which I'm going to do, that query is gone. I'm not going to get it back because I didn't save it. So I would have to create it from scratch. Okay, in the next section, we'll look at how to sort query results. In this section, we're going to look at how to sort the results of a query and also how to save a query as well. Remember, when we run a query, the results of that query are displayed in a table, and we can sort a table just as we did when we were looking at sorting and filtering, the sorting and filtering section. It's always better to sort a table usually, whether it's a table or whether it's the results of a query that you're running that are displayed in a table, because it's easier to read. It's normally easier to read data that's sorted based on a particular field or based on a particular column, like alphabetically or maybe ascending to descending in terms of smallest number to largest number. Or if it was a date or time, maybe earliest to latest or most recent to earliest or whatever. So that's why we might want to sort the results of a query. And we also definitely need to save a query as well. We need to look at how to save a query. So if you were struggling in the last section with how to make a query, I'd urge you to go back and look at that video again, but also don't worry, because we're going to do it again essentially in this section. We're going to create a query from scratch. This time we're going to sort the results of that query, and we're also going to save it. So let's jump in. We need a database open, of course, so I'm going to click on File, and I'm going to open up the Houses database. And we have 3 objects, 3 tables and 1 form, so we have 4 objects altogether. Now we're going to ignore the form, and in fact we're going to ignore most of the tables. We're only going to look at the Houses table. So what we want to do is we want to create a query based on the Houses table. In other words, we're trying to extract certain information from the Houses table. Now, I don't need to open up the Houses table in order to do that. I'm just going to click on Create, and we have 2 options, Query Wizard or Query Design. We're going to ignore Query Wizard and we're going to click on Query Design. And now the query has opened up. You can see its tab here, and the very first thing that it's asking us, that Access asks us, is what table do you want to base the query on? We only have 3 tables in our database: house details, houses, and location. So we can select the table that we want by either double left clicking on it or clicking once in it and selecting Add. So that says to Access we are going to be querying the Houses table. I can now close down the Show Table dialog box, and you can see the field list box has now been opened here, which contains a list of all of the fields in the Houses table. I think there's 12 or 13 of them. So if I open up the Houses table, you can see town, address, type, occupied, and so on and so forth. And here they are: town, address, type, occupied, price, and etc. So the next step when you're creating a query is to specify which fields you want to be displayed when you run the query. Which fields for each record are we going to display? Do we want all the fields displayed for each record when we run the query, or do we only want some of the fields displayed for each record? In this particular instance, I'm going to select the town field and address, type, occupied, and price. So remember from the previous section, when we want to include a field, we can either double left click on it and it will be included in the query grid down here, as it's called. We can see the town has been put in. So the field is town, the table it's coming from is houses. So that's fine. That's one way of doing it. Or we can click and drag onto the query grid like that, and it will be placed into the first available column, which in this case is the first column. But a quicker way of doing it, if you're doing multiple ones that are all together, if you remember from our Computer Essential days when we used the Computer Essentials, when we used our Shift key and Control key to select adjacent and non-adjacent objects in a folder in the File Explorer window, we can do the same with the fields. I'm going to left click once on town, I'm going to hold down Shift, and I'm going to left click on price. And what that's going to do is it's going to include town and price, and then the other fields in between, address, type, and occupied. Now what I can do is I can left click on any of them at all and drag them down onto the query grid, and it will occupy, they will occupy the number of columns that they need to occupy. So they will occupy 5 columns because there was 5 fields. So I'll do that again. Left click on the first field that I want, hold down Shift, left click on the last field, and then release your Shift button and then click and drag, and all of them are now inserted. Great. So now I'm going to run this column, this query. So I'm going to click on Design, click on Run, and great, I get back all 30 records. But this time I only get back the 4 fields, or the 5 fields that I've included: town, address, type, occupied, and price, which is exactly what I want. I didn't want all of them. If we go back to Design View, I'm in Datasheet View now for the query, just as you can be in Datasheet View for a table. For a table object, you can be in Datasheet View for a query as well. But I want to go back to Design View, and I want to show you town, address, type, occupied, and price. That's the only reason that we're seeing these 5 fields and not all of them, okay? Because don't forget, there are many more fields in the houses table, but I've asked it to only show me these 5 fields for each record. So just go back to design view and we can see it there. So this is kind of similar to what we did with filters. Now the disadvantage with filters is that we can apply a filter, and we can even apply multiple filters, but the disadvantage is that I can save a filtered table, but then if I want to apply another filter or modify that filter and I save the table again, I lose the first filter. I can't save the filter as an object. I can only filter a table and save that table that's been filtered, but I can't save the filter as a standalone object because they're not standalone objects in Microsoft Access, but queries are. So I can now save this query, which I'm going to do very shortly. Before I do though, I'm just going to make a quick change to my to the design of my query. Notice what I'm doing here. I can also right click on the query tab and I can change to design view and change to datasheet view as well. So you can do it that way as well as clicking in view up here and going to datasheet view or design view. In design view, I'm going to type in the name of a town down here. There's a criteria row down here which runs across for each field that you've included in the query grid. And this is where I can really make my queries work for me. I can specifically say that I'm only looking for information from a specific town. I only want to display houses from a specific town. So I'm going to type in the town of Maryport. And if I click run again, I'm now only getting back 4 houses because there are only 4 houses in the database, in that table, that match that criteria, where town is set to Maryport. If I was to double left click on houses, I can see Maryport, Maryport. It's in there 4 times. Now, obviously, for a small table like this, you could go into the table and you could visually see, yeah, there's only 4 of them there. But imagine if you had hundreds or even thousands of entries in your database. You certainly would have hundreds of them anyway for you know, for instance, for an estate agent or a letting agency or a property company like this. So it would take too long. So that's the power of the query. So I'll go back to design view. And I'm going to add another level of criteria. But this time I'm going to show you how to, before I do, I've decided I don't want the occupied column in there. So I want to delete the occupied field. Remember from our Microsoft Excel and Word days when we were working with tables, we saw that we could select a column by hovering our mouse pointer over the top of the column. It changes to a black arrow pointing down. If I left click once, the column is selected, the entire column is selected, and I can now delete that column by pressing the delete key, not the backspace key, but the delete key. The backspace key won't do anything, but the delete key will delete that column. So now I've decided that I want to include bedrooms. So I'm going to left click on bedrooms and drag it down onto the query grid. Now if I click run, I'm only going to be shown houses in Maryport, but this time the bedrooms column and the number of bedrooms in each house as it was input into the database is also displayed. So again, very, very powerful in terms of specifying exactly what information you want. Let's make it even more specific. Let's look for only 2-bedroomed houses in Maryport. If I left click on the criteria row in the bedroom column, the bedrooms column, and type in the number 2. And now if I click run, I should get only 3. Because one of the 4 I think had 3 or 4 bedrooms. So basically the table is now the table that's appearing as a result of running the query is only going to display 2-bedroomed houses. In other words, records for where Maryport is the town and where bedrooms is 2. So that's a very, very powerful facility of queries. So that's creating the query again from scratch. If I go back to design view, I can delete both of these criteria like so. Click on run and I'm back to the way I was. So here's my query just originally with basically every record in the database and with these 5 fields. If we wanted to sort this, because this section also needs to look at sorting, if I left click on any one of these fields, I'm going to sort it on the price column or the price field. You don't need to select the entire price column, just any one of these records at all. And then in the sort and filter group, I can click on ascending, where it starts from the smallest and moves to the largest, or the smallest number to the largest number, or I can click on descending, and you can see that the table has moved around in order to match that. So I'll leave it set to ascending, okay. And I'm going to put back in my design criteria as well. So I'm going to type in, Actually, no, I'll just type in 2 for bedrooms. I'll delete Maryport. So if I click on run now, I should get a list of all houses in the houses table which have 2 bedrooms. And I'm going to sort this on ascending order. So great. So I can see that the cheapest house with 2 bedrooms is in Cleaton Moor. It's 8,500, and the most expensive house is 27 grand, and that's the address and the town. Great. So I'm going to leave this query open, and we're also now going to look in this same section, we're going to look at saving the query results, because don't forget, if I move this, or if I go to close this query down, I did this in the last video. I intentionally closed the query down to show you that if you close a query without saving it, you lose it. You don't get it back. You'd have to make the query again. So I'm going to click on cancel here. There are a number of ways of saving a query. If I click on the save button in the quick access toolbar when my query is open, it's going to give me a save as box. You can see that query 1 has been put in as a suggested alternate name, or temporary name should I say. Query 1 is not a good name. You normally want to name your queries and all of your objects meaningfully. You want to give them meaningful names. So if I click OK, I will save it as query 1, or I could type in a name. I'll click cancel. That's one way of saving it. Second way of saving it is our keyboard shortcut from Word and Excel. Holding down Control and S will also bring up the save as box for this query. Now, this is crucially important. In Word, in Excel, we're always working just on one file. In Access, an Access database is not just one thing, it's multiple things working together. So you can save individual objects that you're working on. Control and S, or the save button up here in the quick access toolbar, will allow you to save the object that's currently open and that you're currently working on. In this case, I'm currently working on query 1. That's the object that's currently open. So Control and S, or the save button in the quick access toolbar, will allow me to save that object. If I click on File, you'll see that there's a save and a save as option. Save will again allow me to save the object that I'm currently working on. But if I click on Save As, I can also save the object as something else, or I can save the entire database. Now I'm going to come back to that later on at another stage, okay? But just to give you an idea that you can save an object individually, or you can save the entire database by going to File and Save As. For now, I'm just going to click on the Save button to save this query. I'm going to call it Query by Bedroom. It's a good idea to give your queries meaningful names, and click OK. And now my query has appeared in the objects pane over here. Every object gets put into its own pane, and its own section, and every section will have its own object. So forms, tables, and now queries. The only thing we don't have is a report. So we saw briefly how to create that query and how to sort it and how to include some criteria in it. Just briefly show you before we move on, one of the great things about queries, if I double left click on this query, I can run this query at any time. If I double left click on it, I get the number of houses in the database with 2 bedrooms, okay, as you would expect. I'm going to go back to design view, and I'm going to type in Maryport again, okay. So I'm going to save that. And now I'm going to run it again. And now I've only got 3 houses, Maryport, with 2 bedrooms. Now here's a great thing about this database, or about databases and queries in general. If I go back into houses and I add another house, let's say Maryport, and let's say, I don't know, 10 Main Street. And I'm just going to copy a lot of the information from the previous record. But I'm going to make sure it has 2 bedrooms, and then everything else I'll just copy down. I'll be showing you how to do that very shortly as well. Okay, I'm now going to close down houses. I'm now going to run my query again, and this time I have 4 records. I have the one that I've just added as well. I didn't need to update my query. The queries are dynamic. They will always pull the most up-to-date and most recently added information from the table. If I add another house, and again, I'll just copy most of this stuff. And again, add another 2-bedroomed house, but make everything else, it doesn't matter whether everything else is the same as well. I'm just going to close down the houses table and close down the query, run it again. I should now have 5 records. So the query is always going to take the most accurate information. And again, that's an area where queries score massively over filters. We can really fine-tune the query. We can run the query at any point in time by double left clicking on it, and it's always going to have the most up-to-date and accurate information taken from the table. So that's again one of the considerable powers of queries, and one of the reasons that they're such a fundamental object and so useful in Microsoft Access. Because if you think about it, there's not much point in having all of this data in the database if we can't get it out, and we can't get it out easily. So in the next section, we're going to look at how to print the results of a query. So we saw briefly how to create that query and how to sort it and how to include some criteria in it. Just briefly show you before we move on, one of the great things about queries, if I double left click on this query, I can run this query at any time. If I double left click on it, I get the number of houses in the database with 2 bedrooms, okay, as you would expect. I'm going to go back to design view and I'm going to type in Maryport again, okay. So I'm going to save that. And now I'm going to run it again. And now I've only got 3 houses, Maryport, with 2 bedrooms. Now here's a great thing about this database, or about databases and queries in general. If I go back into houses and I add another house, let's say Maryport, and let's say, I don't know, 10 Main Street. And I'm just going to copy a lot of the information from the previous record. But I'm going to make sure it has 2 bedrooms, and then everything else I'll just copy down. I'll be showing you how to do that very shortly as well. Okay, I'm now going to close down houses. I'm now going to run my query again, and this time I have 4 records. I have the one that I've just added as well. I didn't need to update my query. The queries are dynamic. They will always pull the most up-to-date and most recently added information from the table. If I add another house, and again, I'll just copy most of this stuff. And again, add another 2-bedroomed house, but make everything else, it doesn't matter whether everything else is the same as well. I'm just going to close down the houses table and close down the query, run it again. I should now have 5 records. So the query is always going to take the most accurate information. And again, that's an area where queries score massively over filters. We can really fine-tune the query. We can run the query at any point in time by double left clicking on it, and it's always going to have the most up-to-date and accurate information taken from the table. So that's again one of the considerable powers of queries, and one of the reasons that they're such a fundamental object and so useful in Microsoft Access. Because if you think about it, there's not much point in having all of this data in the database if we can't get it out, and we can't get it out easily. So in the next section, we're going to look at how to print the results of a query. In this section, we're going to look at how to print the results of a query. Okay, so often you'll need to print a hard copy of the query results. Somebody might want to look at the results of a query from a database. So it's very easy to print out the results of a query. Let's open up, in fact, we're going to continue working on the database that we were previously working on, the houses database. So if I remember that we created a query and we called it query by bedroom. And if I go into design view, we specified that we wanted houses in Maryport with 2 bedrooms to be displayed from our houses table when we ran the query. So if I run the query, you'll see that I have 5 houses in Maryport that fit that criteria, that have 2 bedrooms. So I'll close that down. Actually, no, sorry, I'll open it back up again because I'm going to run it again. So if we want to run the query, just right click on it, go to design view, and then we click on run. So this is what we want to print. Okay, this is what we want to print. So it's very easy to print. Just click on file and we click on print. And we get up the following. This is slightly different to Word and Excel, where you immediately get a print preview over here on the right hand side of the document that you're going to print. It works slightly differently in Access. We have to click on print preview to actually see what this is going to look like when we print it. And we have our mouse pointer looks like a magnifying glass. We can zoom in and zoom out. We can also zoom in and zoom out down here as well, which gives you a greater level of zooming. But zooming in and zooming out like this will just bring it forwards and backwards by whatever you had selected down here. The There's really not much to say in this section apart from that if we wanted to, we could change the default is portrait. You'll remember this from Word and Excel as well. We could change it to landscape if we wanted to as well. And in fact, that's something we're going to want to do here because we had specified that we wanted the town, address, type, price, and the bedroom field to be displayed on this report. But you can see that we're not able to fit the bedroom. But if I click on landscape, we can fit all of them on that one page. Okay, and very often obviously you'd have more columns going across as well, so we could also do that as well. We could fit the more columns as well. We could also change margins over here as well if we wanted to. We're not going to look at that, but it's very similar to Word and Excel. If we clicked on margins, we could specify normal margins, which is what we currently are at, or we could go wide, or we could go narrow, which will create a very, very narrow margin, and that would enable us to fit even more columns across as well. But I'm just going to go back to normal, okay? We could also change the size of the page that we're printing on, so A4 is the default, but you could print it to a different size page if you wanted to. So when you're happy with that, it's going to look the way you want it to look, you can click on Close Print Preview, click on File and Print again, and then click on Print. If you click on Quick Print, it's going to send the object directly to the default printer without asking you anything that it's going to ask us in a second when we click on Print. But if I click on Print here, it's going to bring up this dialog box, and again, this will be very familiar to you from Word and Excel. We can click on the box here and we can select the number of copies that we want. If our report, or sorry, not our report, but our query, if that was spanning multiple pages, I could click on the Pages radio button. These circles are called radio buttons. All is selected by default, but if I click on Pages, I can specify from pages 1 to whatever. I could also click on Selected Records if I wanted to. In order for that to work, I would have to click and drag, for instance, these first 3 records here. What I've done is I've clicked on the square, the row selector beside each one, I've held my mouse button down and I've dragged down. So if I wanted to just print those 3 records, I would click on Selected Records, and then I would click OK. Now I won't actually do it here because you can't see it printing, and even if I did, you wouldn't be able to see the printout. But that's really all there is to printing from a query. Don't forget, when you run a query, it's always displayed in a table. So when I double left clicked on the query here to run it, the results of that query, the output of that query, if you like, were displayed in a table. And then I can simply print that table by going to clicking on File and Print, and then making the relevant changes that I need to here. So that's all there is to it. Don't forget, in the in the Access exam in ECDL, you won't actually be asked to print, but you might be asked to change some settings as if you were going to print. So that's all we need to know for printing query results. In this section, we're going to look at how to query related tables. And the technique is exactly the same for querying one table, except that at the show table stage, we can include more than one table in our query. And what we can do then is we can choose fields from both tables, which would give us a result that wouldn't be possible from an individual table. So we'll see how this works now, and we'll see the logic behind it. I'm going to open up the Daily 1 database, which you might recall from previous lessons. That was the garage or the mechanics database, okay, and it had 2 tables in it, repairs and vehicles. So if we open them up, just to refresh our memory, we saw that the repairs table is basically just a table that has a list of jobs. Everybody gets a job number, or each job gets a job number, and then a mechanic, reg number, and date of repair field. And then in the vehicles table, we can see reg number, model, engine capacity, and so on and so forth. So we include the details of each vehicle here. And we can see a plus sign beside each record in the vehicles table. So that means that there's a relationship between this table and between another table in the database. Now, the only other table that this vehicles table could be related to is repairs, because repairs is the only other table in the database. So the plus sign means that there are sub-data sheets for each record. In other words, if I click at the plus sign, I can see the number of times that this vehicle is included or mentioned or referenced in the repairs table. So this vehicle is included once. This vehicle has had 3 jobs done on it by various different mechanics and various different dates in the repairs table, and so on and so forth. So clicking the plus sign will let you look at the data sheets, and then clicking on the minus sign will collapse the data sheets. So that was just to refresh your memory on the relationship between the two. And in fact, if I go to Database Tools and click on the Relationships button, I can see that I have a one-to-many relationship between the Vehicles table and the Repairs table. In other words, one vehicle can have had many repairs done on it, all right? And there's the one on the vehicle side of the relationship, and the little infinity symbol is the many symbol on the repair side. So that's the one-to-many relationship. And the field that's linking the two tables is reg number, okay? That's what's creating the relationship between the two tables. So I'll click on close, and now let's see how to create a query based on these two related tables. So the process is pretty much the same. We go to create and we go to query design, and this time in the show table dialog box, instead of just adding one table, I'm going to add both of them. And you can double left click on each one individually if you want to, or if you want, I'll show you a quick way of doing that. I'm going to, I'll just do it from scratch actually. I'm going to click on create and query design, and this time I'm going to double left click, hold down control and then left click once on each of the tables. So you can select multiple tables. Remember from our Computer Essentials days, holding down control will let you select multiple non-adjacent, in this case the two of them are right together anyway, the items. So holding down control will select, and left clicking will select both of them, and then I can add them both at the same time. And now I can click on close. Now the OCD in me wants to have the one on this side and the many on this side. It really doesn't matter because it's still a one-to-many relationship. But I'm going to just drag the repairs table by left clicking and dragging it over. So we can still see one-to-many here. It's still a one-to-many relationship. All right, now let's create our query criteria, or our fields that we're including in this query. Remember from when we were querying a single table, we dragged down our fields. We're going to do exactly the same thing here. So from the vehicle side, I'm going to drag down registration number. I'm going to drag down model. And what else? I'm going to drag down manufacturer. And then from the repairs table, what I'm going to do is drag down mechanic, and I'm going to drag down date of repair. All right, that's it. So let's run this query and see what it looks like. And there you go. We're pulling information now from both tables. That's what we're doing. We're pulling reg number, model, and manufacturer from the vehicles table, and we're pulling mechanic and date of repair from the repairs table. So this wouldn't have been possible just querying one table. We wouldn't have been able to get this combination of information from both tables. If I right click on query one and go back to design view, just draw your attention down here to where it says field. That's always going to display the name of the field that you just dragged down or double left clicked on. But in the table, notice that it doesn't say the same table all the way across. Reg number is coming from the vehicles table, model is coming from vehicles, and so is manufacturer. But mechanic and date of repair are both coming from the repairs table. So just to alert you to that, okay? Now I'm going to enter in some criteria down here. Remember we saw from when we were doing a query on one table, we could kind of drill down and be more specific and ask the query to only return certain information. And we can do the same here as well. So in the mechanic column, I'm going to left click on the criteria row and I'm going to type in David. In other words, I only want to see information on repairs that were done by the mechanic David. So if I left click on run, I now only see two jobs. The query is now filtering out everything that wasn't done by David. So we can still specify criteria in a query that's working on related tables. So just run that again. Now, of course, it wouldn't make much sense, of course, if I know that I don't really need to have the mechanic column in this, because I know I've already done the criteria bit down here, David. So I know when I run the query that these jobs have been done by David. So this mechanic column here is superfluous. We don't really need it. So I'm going to go back to design view. Instead of removing it, I'm going to just click on the show box, the show checkbox to clear it, okay? If I run the query again, I now see all of the jobs that were done by David, but I don't need to see the mechanic I don't need to see David's name here, okay? Because all the information that's in this table, in this query, applies to him anyway. Don't forget when you do that, when you clear the box, you're not removing that field from the query. We can still use it for selection or sorting purposes. We're just hiding it, okay? So I'll turn it back on again, and then run it, and then the mechanic column is back in and David is back in because he's the criteria for this particular query. Let's do a print preview on it. Let's see what it would look like. File and print preview, and there we go. Reg number, model, manufacturer, mechanic, and date of repair. All right, so let's close the print preview. We won't actually print it. What I'm going to do is go back into design view for this query, and just in case you're wondering, you may have forgotten from the previous section, we can click on view up here and go to design view. We're currently in datasheet view for this query. I can do it there, or I can right click on query. I normally do that. I right click on the query tab and go to design view. I'm going to move the cursor above the date of repair column, and I'm going to remove it. Okay, I'm going to remove it. So I'm going to left click once here on date of repair, and I'm going to remove it. Before I do, you might be thinking, well, how did I know which fields to drag down for this query? How did I know to click down and drag down reg number and model in manufacturers for vehicles, and mechanic and date of repair from repairs? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on what you want to see in the query. The example in the book, you can just imagine that this is what you want to see when you run this query. You want to see the reg number, the model, and the manufacturer for the vehicle, and you want to see who worked on the vehicle and the date that they worked on it. So it entirely depends. You could have clicked and dragged down any of these fields from these tables into the query. It just depends on what you want to see. So I'm going to delete the date of repair column. So remember, we hover our mouse over a column, it changes into a black arrow pointing down. That selects the entire column, and then we press the delete key. Not backspace, because that won't do anything, but we press the delete key to delete that column. And now if we run the query again, we can see reg number, model, manufacturer, and only mechanic. Okay, only mechanic. So that's all there is. That's all there is to querying related tables. What you do when you query related tables is you combine information, whatever information you want, whatever information you need to see in that query, from both of those tables. Obviously, you can have, in larger databases, you might have multiple tables, and we can click and drag multiple fields from multiple tables. But we're keeping it simple, and unfortunately for ECDL at this level, we only look at querying 2 related tables. So that's all there is to that. In the next section, we'll look at how to edit existing queries. In this section, we're going to look at editing queries, okay, because there might be occasions when several similar queries are required. So we're going to pretend that we have a query. We don't have one yet. I'm going to create another one from scratch. But we're going to pretend that we want to edit an existing query that we've saved, because there might be circumstances where very similar-ish queries are needed. So what you can do in that case is you can edit a query that you have rather than set up and save a new one. Now, if you want to, you can, of course, save queries for each particular case that you require. But very often what people do is that they may edit an existing query to match new criteria or to get different results. Okay, so what you could do, example, let's say you have an address query maybe, and the only criterion that might change is maybe the beginning of a postcode. Then what you could do is you could run the query for that postcode, print or preview the result, and then you could edit the query for another postcode. And then you could either close the query down without saving it, or you could save it with the new postcode criteria as well. It's entirely up to yourself. Now, there is a more advanced form of querying known as parameterized queries, where when you run the query, you're actually asked to put in what it is that you're looking for. That's more advanced access, and we don't need to worry about it. So for our purposes, we're just going to look at how to edit existing queries, because we want to base a query on a very similar case. We want to look for something very similar to what this query is giving us. I'll show you an example now. I'm going to open up, as I've already opened up, the daily database. That's the mechanics or garage database. I don't have any query yet, so I'm going to create one. Click on create, click on, sorry, not query wizard, but query design. And remember, these two tables are linked, so I'm going to select both of them. I don't need to, but I'm going to select both of them because I'm going to pretend that the query I want to run and the information that I want to get out is from both of these tables. So I've added both of the tables to the query. And I'm just going to add the reg number from the vehicles table, the model, and I'm going to add, we'll say the price, okay? And from the repairs table, I'm going to add the mechanic and let's say the date of repair. All right, and I'm going to save this query. Actually, before I do, what I'll do is in the criteria row, because I'm going to save it as with a specific name. Remember, in the criteria row for each of these columns or each of these fields, I can specify criteria so that Access will only look for records which match the criteria that I've typed in. I'm going to type in David in the mechanic column, which means that when I run this query, I get jobs back that David had carried out. Okay, we saw in the previous section as well that we don't really need the mechanic column because all the information in this table is obviously going to be David's. It's going to be related to jobs David has done, so the mechanic column is really superfluous, but we leave it in there. So don't forget to save a query. You can left click on the save button, or you can hold down Control and S, and that will always save the object that you're currently working on. I'm going to call this query by David. It's a good idea to give your queries relevant, meaningful names so that somebody within this organization will look at this query and will know that when they run it, they will get jobs or records back related to David. In other words, cars that David worked on or repaired. Great. So that's all there is to that. We know now how to create a query and how to save it from the last section as well. What I want to do now, though, is I want to change the criteria for this. I want to, instead of having David's stuff return back to me, I want Richard's stuff. So in other words, jobs that Richard worked on and records that Richard worked on. If I click on the repairs table, I can see that Richard is in there, I think 2 or 3 times. But you can imagine a huge, let's say a very large database with hundreds and hundreds of entries. You don't want to look through them, so that's the whole point of queries. I could, of course, create a brand new query from scratch by going to Create and Query Design and then add all this stuff again, and then this time type in Richard instead of David. But I have a query already which is very, very similar to what I need. All I need to do is tweak this one. So I'm going to right click on this, go to Design View, and instead of David, I'm simply going to type in Richard. And then when I run this query, I'm going to get back Richard's jobs. All right. So that's all there is to editing an existing query. I could edit, of course, if I go back in to Design View, I could edit any of I can type in new criteria, I could edit any of these fields. But I wanted to look at Richard's job specifically. Let's get somebody else. Let's type in, sorry, I should be in the repairs table. Yeah, let's go with Stephen this time. So if I left click, delete Richard, if I type in Stephen, if I click on Design and click on Run, now I get Stephen's jobs back. So this is what we can do. What we can do is we can edit existing queries if they're very, very similar to something that we want to do. We don't need to create a new query from scratch. Now what you need to be careful of course, is that I have this saved as query by David, but if I go into Design View, don't forget I've now changed it to Stephen. You have to be really careful here, because if you click on Save, which I won't do, well I will, okay, I'll save it and I'm going to close it down. Somebody would come in the next day and see query by David. Let's do a query to see what jobs David has worked on. They double left click on it and then they see Stephen's name is in there. So this goes back to this is a non-database problem. This goes back to our save and save as issues that you can have when you should be saving as instead of saving. So I'm going to change this back to David. Sorry, not delete it. I'm going to Design View for this, and I'm going to change this back to David. Run it again to make sure that we get David's jobs. Save it. And now what I'll do is I'll go into Design View again, and this time I'll type in Richard, and if I run it, I've got Richard's. So what I will do in this case is I'm going to save this query with a new name. Now here's where we come into something which I briefly mentioned in the last section. I can't Control and S or click on the Save button here because it's going to save it as query by David. It's not going to ask me to give it a new name. So how do I save this query as a whole new query? How do I give it a new name? For that I need to go up to File and I need to go to Save As. Not Save, but Save As. And I get the following options. I can choose to save the database or I can choose to save the object. What I want is I want to save the object because the query is an object. It's one of the 4 objects we work on in Access. So I want to save the object. And I want to click on Save As, and I'm going to get a dialog box here which is asking me, what do I want to save it as? I can save it as copy of query by David because the original name is query by David, so Access just recommends saving it as copy of and then query by David. But I'm going to call it query by Richard. And we can leave this set here. We don't need to worry about this. We're always going to save it as query. And then just click OK. Now I've got 2 queries here. I've got query by David and query by Richard. And if I double left click on query by David, the original query by David opens up. Query by Richard is still open up as well. Let's do that again and let's save it for somebody else. I'm going to open up any of these. It doesn't matter which one I open up. These are now, if you like, they're kind of like templates. And instead of David for the mechanic, I'm going to type in Stephen. Again, I need to save this as something else. I don't want to save here and I don't want to click on File and Save because that will save it as query by David but with Stephen in the mechanic, so I get Stephen's jobs back when I run query by David. That would not be good. So what I want to do is go to File and Save As, make sure that I am clicking on Save Object As. You're not saving the whole database, you're just saving this individual object. And I'm going to click on Save As, and again I'm going to type in query by, and this time Stephen. And again you can leave it set to as query down here and click OK. Now I have 3 queries. I'm going to close query by Stephen down, and I can double left click on either of those. Query by Stephen gives me Stephen's jobs, query by Richard gives me Richard's jobs, and query by David gives me David's jobs. Now, as I said, there is a more advanced feature in Access which allows you to do what's known as parameterized queries, where if you double left click on a query, the first thing that Access would ask you for is what mechanic do you want to look for. So instead of having loads and loads of different queries for individual mechanics, we could create a parameterized query. But we don't need to look at that. We don't need to worry about in this section. So the last thing I'll show you how to do in this section is how to move the columns. I'm going to go into I'll go into query by David. It doesn't matter which one I go into. I'll close these two down just to avoid any confusion, and I'll go into query by David. And it may be that you want to move one of these fields. Okay, it may be that you've got the fields in the wrong order. It really doesn't matter, of course, what order the fields are in, but you might decide that you want to have the date of repair, let's say, after the reg number, or you might want to have the reg number after the model. I'm going to pretend that I want to move the date of repair to the first. I want it to be the first in line. Okay, I want it to be before anything. I want it to be before reg number, model, price, or mechanic. It's easy enough to do. All you have to do is left click. Now, when I say it's easy, it's fiddly. Okay, it's fiddly. Don't forget, when you're selecting a column, your mouse pointer looks like this. If I left click here, the entire date of repair column is selected. Left click here, mechanic is selected, and so on. So I don't want to click there. What I do want to do is click just underneath it. Can you see this very, very narrow section here, this gray section here? I'm going to click here to show you. Of course, the whole column will go black because the column will be selected. What you want to do is left click there. Your mouse pointer must look like this, like the white arrow. Not this, but like this. Hold your mouse button down. Keep your left mouse button held down, and you'll notice that the column is selected, and you'll see a gray a kind of box underneath my mouse pointer, which means that the column is ready to move. You'll also see a very thick black line to the left of the column. I'm now keeping my mouse button held down, and I'm dragging my mouse to the left. And wherever the black line is, when I release the mouse button, my column will appear to the right of that line. So I'm going to release, and there you go. You can see the date of repair was moved to the very, very front. Now that's not something I can undo. So I'm just going to redo it again. I'm going to drag this back and show you again how to do it. So left click on this narrow section here. If you click here to select the column, you're just going to select all of the columns if you click and drag, so you don't want that. So you have to click underneath it. Your mouse pointer must look like this. Okay, it's that narrow gray bar at the top. When you left click on that, the column is selected, and you'll see a white section to the very, very left of the black section, and then just a very thin, narrow white section, and then you'll see a black bar. That means the entire column is selected, and the dotted or kind of gradient gray rectangle underneath my mouse pointer. All of those three things mean that the column is ready to move. So I'm holding my mouse button down. This time I'm going to put it in between reg number and model. So I'm clicking and keeping my mouse button held down. Sorry, not clicking, I'm dragging. And I'm dragging it to the to the left of the model column and to the right of the reg number column. So when I release the mouse button, it's going to be placed in between those two columns. Okay, and then of course I can save, and when I run, this time I'll see reg number and date of repair is here this time instead of being over here. So that's all there is to moving columns around, and that's all there is to editing queries as well. So in the next section, we're coming to the end of the query section. In the next section, we're going to look at ranges of values and wildcards and see how to use wildcards in our queries. For this section, we're going to look at how to use ranges of values and wildcards within our queries. We looked at how to use wildcards, and in fact we looked at how to use ranges of values as well in filters. We'll start with ranges of values and then we'll move on to wildcards. If you recall, when we used wildcards in the search facility, that was where we used them, and I had said that we didn't need to know wildcards for the search facility and access, and you don't. By which I mean you're not going to be asked any questions regarding wildcards in the exam for using the search facility and access, but you will be asked at least one question in that section for using wildcards and queries. So looking at them in the search facility was kind of a nice gentle introduction to them. We're not looking at any new information or new wildcards, we'll be looking at the same wildcards, but specifically in this section we'll be looking at how to use them in queries. We'll start with ranges of values though. And what does that mean? Well, you might want to perform a query that doesn't contain precise values. If I go into the daily database, and if I go into any one of these queries that I created in the last video, design view, I can see that I'm searching for something specifically. I'm searching for David in the mechanic column. That's my criteria, which means that if I run this query, I'm only going to get jobs that were performed by David, which is all well and good for text, but I might want to look, let's say, for price, and I might want to look at vehicles for whose the cost was, let's say, greater than a certain value or less than a certain value, or in between a range of certain values. So we're going to be looking at the following four operators. We call them operators. We're going to be looking at, and these should be popping up in the video now, greater than, we'll be looking at less than, we'll be looking at greater than equal to, and we'll be looking at less than equal to. So those are the four operators, and they can allow you to process data depending on its order. And as with exact matches, what we do is we type the required range into the appropriate field, into the criteria row on the appropriate field in the query grid. So for example, if you were in, let's say, you wanted to check your stock level of a certain item, you could type in something like less than 100. In the stock level field of a table to display all items with less than 100 in stock. That's just one example. Wildcards are going to be used in queries to match patterns in data, okay, to search for certain patterns in data. For example, all employees whose last names begin with Mac, M-A-C, or end with the letters S-O-N. And the following wildcard characters are used. These are very similar to, in fact, they're identical to the wildcards that we looked at in the search facility. The star will replace one or more characters, and the question mark will replace a single character. So, for example, wildcards could be used to select salespeople from their job titles, which may be sales assistant or sales supervisor. So the wildcard there would be sales. So we're looking for anything with sales in the title. All right. First of all, let's look at some operators for our ranges of values. So I've got the daily database open, and I'm going to create a new query here, which is good practice for us. So I'm going to go into query design, and I'm just going to create a query based on one table, just the vehicles table. So I'm going to add that. As you can see, I've added it. Here's the field list, and I'm going to close the show table box. I'm going to place the reg number in the query grid. I'm going to place the model, double left clicking on it, different method of doing the same thing. And finally, I'm going to scroll down here and I'm going to double left click and put the price field in the query grid. All right. What I want to do is I want to find all cars costing less than 30,000. All right, all cars less than 30,000. So all I do in the criteria row under price, make sure you're in the right column, is I type in less than 30,000. That's it. Now let's run the query and let's see what we get back. And we get back all of the vehicles that are less than 30,000. And because I only put reg number and model into the query grid, that's all I'm seeing. I'm not seeing all of the other information. I'm only seeing reg number, model, and price. And for price, the criteria is less than 30,000. Great. Now we can also have multiple criteria, of course, in the same query. We saw that as well. I'm going to go back to design view for this query, and I'm going to add the previous owners field to the query grid by double left clicking on it. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in the following: greater than equals 4. So that's greater than or equals to 4. So in other words, I'm looking for vehicles that cost less than 30,000 and have had 4 or more owners. So this is multiple criteria. Let's click on run and see what we get back. We get back the following 5 vehicles. Previous owners, as you can see, all these numbers will be 4 or greater. So 6, 4, 8, 4, and 5. So I'll go back to design view. So we have now two criteria. We have less than 30,000 for the price, and we have greater than or equals to 4 for the previous owners. All right, so both criteria have to be met for a record to be selected. This is an example of what we're going to be looking at very shortly, known as an AND query. Both of this criteria and this criteria have to be met. Let's save this query. Because I'm not basing this query on an existing query, this wasn't something I opened up and I'm not tweaking it or editing it like we did in the last section, I can click on the Save button and I'm going to call it Query by Owners and click OK. And of course now I can double left click to run that query whenever I want. And of course the great thing again as well about queries is that if I add any more records to the vehicles table which match this query, the criteria in this query will automatically find them. Okay, it's always going to extract the most recent information, the most recently added information to the vehicles table. I don't need to update the query, it's always going to find any new records that I add that match the criteria in this query. Okay, I'll close this down, and in fact I'm going to close down this database as well by clicking on File and Close. So that's all there is to ranges of values. So greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to. Let's open up the houses database now, and let's go to, let's see, we'll open up the houses table. We'll keep it simple. The houses table. So we have 32 records. You may have more, you may have less, depending on what you've been doing. I can recall adding 2 houses in Maryport, so you may have fewer records than I do, but don't worry about it. You'll have all the recent information, or the information that was in there when you opened up the file from scratch, when I emailed it to you. All the records that were in there anyway. So I'm going to create another query, so I'm going to click on Create. Again, I'm going to go to Query Design, and I'll base it on the houses table. And I'll click on Close. And I'm going to add the following fields to the query. Town, I'll add address, I'll add type, and I'll add price. And I'll stick in comment as well. Now what we want is we want to find properties where detached or semi-detached is a feature in the type field. If I go back to houses and have a look at type, you can see detached, semi-detached, detached, and so on and so forth. You might have a semi-detached bungalow or a detached bungalow as well. Now we don't, but you could theoretically have that. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to cover my bases here. And I'll show you exactly what I mean. In the criteria row for type, if I type in detached, and again it's not case sensitive, and if I click on design and if I click on run, I don't get anything back. And the reason I don't get anything back is because if you look at the houses table, the criteria is going to look for exactly the word detached, but nowhere in the type field does it just say detached. It's either detached house or semi-detached house, or as we saw, it could be also detached bungalow. There is an example of a detached bungalow, or it could be a semi-detached bungalow. But my query criteria is just the word detached. So this is an example of a wildcard. I want to use a wildcard to look for any field or any record which has in the type field the word detached in it. So this is where wildcards come to the rescue. What I'm going to do is going to type in, instead of detached, I'm going to type in star detached star. Now don't forget, star will replace any number of characters, 1 or more characters. So I'm covering my bases by saying something detached or detached something. So now if I click the run button in the design tab, you can see that I get back detached house, semi-detached house, detached house, and so on and so forth. So that is where the wildcards come in. Now you can see that Access changes it to like detached. You can ignore that, but I'll type it in again. Star detached star. So the star means any number of characters and detached, but I also want to cover for afterwards, after detached. So instead of semi-detached something, I also want to look for detached something. So that's why I have a star in front and after the word detached. And when I click on run, I get back the following. So that's enough information to find all of the possible occurrences, because a wildcard character denotes, don't forget the star, any amount of text that can occur before or after the word detached. Let's go back to design view for this query. And let's see, I'm going to delete the criteria in the type field. and I'm going to type the following in the address field. Now, this is going to look kind of strange. Star or question mark AD, right? It does look odd, but let's just think of our wildcard rule. A star will replace one or more characters. A question mark replaces a single character. So what this is going to do is it's going to look for all records where the address ends in, have you guessed, road. Okay, something, that's the star part of it, something, any number of characters, and then or question mark, a question mark is a single character, AD. Let's see what we get back when we run it. And we get back Toad Road, Harrison Road, Chapel Road, Concord Road, and Chapel Road. Okay, that's all that we get back. So go back in and have a look at that again. So I'll type it in again actually from scratch. So we type in star, that's any number of characters, or question mark AD. The star looks for any number of characters in front of the text that we're looking for, or in front of the text that we type in. Then or, and then the question mark looks for just one single character, and then AD. So that's going to look for anything road. Anything road. Click on run, and we do get back that. Now it wouldn't just look for road, it would look for anything or anything AD, okay? But all we have in matching the criteria in the address field for any of the towns or for any of the houses is the word road. I'm struggling to think of another word that you could spell which wasn't or OAD. I'm sure there are probably one or two. Read, READ, 66 Toad Read, it would find that. In fact, let me do that. Let me type into houses just to, I'm going to type into address 22 Main. This wouldn't make any sense, I know, but READ, and I'll copy everything else just to show you exactly how it works. So I'll save that. Again, if I run the query by going to, click on the query here, go to design view and run it again. Now it's found 22 main read, because again, going back into design view, it's going to look for anything, any number of characters, that's your star, and then or, and then one specific character, which is a question mark, and AD. So that's it. That's all we need to know about ranges of values and wildcards. You don't need to know wildcards for searching, but you do need to know wildcards for queries, and they're very, very useful and very, very powerful in queries. That's all there is to it. So thanks for watching, and what we'll look at in the next section are non-matches, something called non-matches or not matches. In this section, we're going to look at non-matches and how to use non-matches in our query. In order to produce results in a query which exclude matches made using other searches, what you can do is you can precede any criteria that you've got in your query grid with what's known as the not operator or the not keyword. So for example, if you had a table of, let's say, sales from different locations, you might want to exclude sales from Dublin, or you might want to exclude sales from Waterford. And that's how we can do it. We can do it using non-matches. In other words, we return only records, every record apart from Dublin or Waterford. Very similar to what we did in filters, except that when we use non-matches in queries, it's a lot more powerful and a lot more efficient as well. So let's have a look at it in practicality. I'm going to go to File and Open, and I'm going to open up the Houses database. And that's got our three tables: house details, houses, and location. I'm going to immediately create a query by left-clicking on Create and going to Query Design. The Show Table dialog box pops up, and this time I'm going to add two tables to this query. I'm going to add house details and location. House details is already selected for me, so all I need to do is hold down Control and left click once on location, and that will skip the houses table, and it will just have both of these tables selected. So using Control and left click to select non-adjacent items. If I click on Add, both of the tables will be added to the query, and now I can close the Show Table dialog box. We can see there's a relationship between the house details and the location table, but it's not a one-to-many relationship. In the past we saw one on one side and the many symbol on the other side for our one-to-many relationships. I'll just give you an idea what kind of relationship this is. If I click on Database Tools and go to Relationships, and then if I right-click on the line between the two tables and go to Edit Relationship, down at the bottom of the Edit Relationships dialog box, which has popped up, you can see that it's a one-to-one relationship. The relationship type is one-to-one. And this makes sense if you think about it, because house details, or the details for a house can only be in one location. It wouldn't make sense. In fact, it wouldn't be possible for a house to be in multiple locations. So that's why we only have one-to-one. One house is in one location. So just to give you an idea of, let's say, a real world scenario, how that might be reflected in terms of a relationship between tables in Access. So click on the close button. No, I don't want to save the changes. Go back to our query. Now we have to decide which fields from each table we want to include in our query. In other words, when we run the query, what fields are going to be displayed for each record. So it's entirely up to ourselves. I'm just going to include from location, I'm going to include, let's see, I'll select type, and I'll also select town. And from house details, I want to select, I'm just going to select price, okay? Select price, that's all. So type, town, and price. And in fact, I've decided that I want to move town over, I want it first, okay? So remember our trick for moving, we have to left click at this very narrow gray section here, hold our left mouse button down and drag it to the left. So if you put fields in the wrong order, or in an order that you don't want when you actually run the query, because don't forget the query is going to display the fields in the order that you've got them here, you can easily move the columns around. So that's what I did just there. Now I'm not going to run the query because that would simply return all of the records and just include town, type, and price for each record. I want to filter my results down. So in the criteria row under town, I'm going to type in the following: not Maryport, not Maryport. And now I'm going to click on the run button by clicking on the design tab and clicking on the run button in the results group. And you can see that I get all 26 records apart from, or well, all 30 whatever records should I say, apart from Maryport. Okay, I don't get Maryport. And that's important. If I click on houses, you'll see, and house details, just to give you an idea, you'll see that Maryport is in there 5 or 6 times. So when I run the query, I'm getting back only 26 records. So I'm getting back the 30, whatever it is, minus the 4 or 5 Maryport records. So that's all there is to using the not keyword. Let's have a look at another way of using it. If I go back to design view for this query, and instead of not Maryport, I'm going to use the not operator. Not is a keyword. I can also use the not operator. And here's what it looks like. The less than, and immediately followed by the greater than, space, and then the name of the town that you want to exclude. In this case, I'll type in not Workington. I must spell it properly as well, of course. Not Workington. So now if I click on the run button, I get back all of the towns. You can see Maryport is back in there now because it's no longer being excluded. But now Workington isn't being excluded. So I've excluded Workington as well. That's it. That's all there is to the not or non-matches using the not keyword and the not operator. You can either type in not, or you can type in the not operator like this. And of course we could do it in multiple fields as well. But we're just going to do it in one field here, just to give you an idea of how to exclude certain records using what's known as a non-match and the non-operator. In the next section, we're going to look at AND queries. We've actually already looked at an AND query previously, but we're going to just go into a little bit more detail. We're going to look at how to look for results between 2 certain values. We did that in filters, but we'll look at how to do it using what's known as an AND query in the next section. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next section. Now that we've looked at non-matches, we're going to have a look at how to do AND queries as well. We've actually already done an AND query in a previous query. If I just open up the daily database, and we had query by David, query by owners, and so on and so forth. If I right-click on query by David and go to design view, we can see that in any query in the criteria row under a particular column, we can put in matching criteria. We can type in text that we're interested in the query actually looking for in that particular field. But we can also do it in multiple fields. We saw that we could look for jobs that were done by David, and we could, let's say, look for a price, let's say less than 30,000. Sorry, less than 30,000. And if we run that query, we should get, we get 2 jobs in this particular instance. So if I go back to design view, that is actually an example of an AND query, because we're asking the query to only return records when this criteria is satisfied and when this criteria is satisfied, hence the name an AND query. In other words, both of this and this, both of these criteria have to be satisfied in order to return any records. If even one of them isn't satisfied, then we won't get any records at all returned. And let me just give you an example of that. If I type in greater than something ridiculous like 100,000 and go to run, I don't get anything back because there are no jobs that David has done which cost more than 100,000. Similarly, if I am just going to undo and go back to greater than 30,000 and put in a name that I know isn't in the database. So if I put in the name Ina, and if I click on run, again, I don't get any records back because, back to the query, there are no jobs that cost less than 30,000 and were done by any mechanic called Ina. So that's an example of an and query. Sometimes it's necessary to, however, match two conditions in a single field. So, for example, a value might need to be higher than one and lower than another. And that's when we can use the word and in a single field. All we have to do is we enter the two queries in the field and we separate them with the word and. And as an alternative, we can also use the word between. I'll give you an example. I'm going to open up the staff database, which is here. And I'm going to create a new query using the staff table. So I click on create, I go to query design, and I'm just going to add one table, the staff table. I click on add, and now I can click close. I'm only going to place the surname in the query grid and the date of birth in the query grid. So those are the only two records, the only two fields that I want appearing for each record when I run the query. So if I was to run it, I'll get back the 13 employees, but only with their surname and date of birth. So straightforward enough. We've done that before. However, I'm now going to go to the date of birth column, and in the criteria row, I'm going to type in the following. Greater than equals 01, the 1st of the 1st, 1960, and it doesn't matter whether you type it in capital letters or not, less than or equal to the 31st of the 12th, I'll type in 69. And what I'm also going to do is I'm going to go back and just type in 60 because that's the format that the dates of birth are in. So what I'm doing here is I'm looking for basically anybody's date of birth between the 1st of the 1st, 1960, and less than or equal to the 31st of the 12th, 69. So that's greater than or equal to the 1st of the 1st, 1960, and less than or equal to the 31st of the 12th, 1969. Let's run it and see what happens. As you can see, we're getting back anybody basically whose date of birth is in the 1960s, all right, because I specified greater than or equal to the 1st of the 1st, 1960, and less than or equal to the 31st of the 12th, 1969. Now that equals to, if I go back to the design, that's pretty important because if I only specified greater than the 1st of the 1st, 1960, I might miss out on, well, I would miss out on somebody who might have been born on the 1st of the 1st, 1960. And similarly, if I didn't have greater than or equals, that equal sign is very important, I might miss out on somebody who was born on the 31st of the 12th, 1969. So you want to hedge your bets there and cover your bases and make sure that you're saying greater than or equals and less than or equals. So that is an example of an AND query being performed on a single field. Okay, we want these two conditions have to be met in the single field, and we simply separate them with the word AND. Let's try another one. We're still in design view. So I'm going to remove the date of birth field by left clicking once on it, and I'm going to press my delete key, and that's it gone. And now I'm going to place the salary field on the grid instead. And now I want to find everybody who earns between a certain amount. Okay, if I open up the staff table, you'll see that one of the fields is a salary. So what I might want to do is query the staff table to find out people who earn between a certain amount. So what I'm going to do is, instead of using, I could use greater than equals. It can get a bit fiddly though, as you saw with all of the operators. So this time I'm going to type in between 15,000 and 20,000. All right, so between 15,000 and 20,000. Go to design view, click on the design tab and then run, and now I can see that everybody who earns between 15 and 20,000. And you can see that the between also takes into account the 15 and 20,000 because neither is on 20,000 and Lee is on 15,000. And everything in between is also captured. So we should have 6 records. So that's pretty much it. That's all that we need to know about AND queries in the same field. We'd already looked at AND queries across multiple fields, but this is specifically targeting a single field when we want to look for records for whose particular field value fall between 2 different values. And don't forget the greater than or equals and less than or equals rule as well, if you want to capture both of those eventualities at the upper and lower end of the range. You can also use the between keyword along with and that's it. That's all we need to know about that. There's now one thing left to do, and that is OR queries. So we've looked at AND queries, but then we're going to look at OR queries, and then we're done. That's the end of the queries chapter. The very last thing we look at in this section are OR queries. And with an OR query, if we have a value within a particular field that we want to match 1 or 2 or more conditions, then we can put those conditions into the appropriate field on the query grid, separated by the word OR. They can also be displayed on separate lines in the query grid. So AND and OR queries are an example of what we call logical operators. The AND operator is a logical operator, and so is the OR query. So I'll give you an example. I've got the houses database open here, and I'm going to create a query based on the houses table. So I'm adding the houses table, and I'm closing down the show table box. And I'm just going to add the town field, I'm going to add the address field, and I'm going to add the bedrooms field. And in the criteria section, under the town column, in the criteria row, I'm going to type in Maryport, and I'm going to type in another town that I know is in the houses table, Aspatria. Now I need to spell it right, Aspatria, unusual town name. If I click on run, I get back 7 houses in Maryport. You may have less, you may have more, depending on what you've been doing with your table. I know I added Maryport, 2 houses in Maryport in on a previous video that I was doing just as an example. So you may only have 6 records coming back. But regardless of how many or how few you have, what you'll find is that this query has only returned houses in the towns of Maryport or Aspatria. And that's because if I go back to design view, I typed in Maryport or Aspatria. I could also have done the following. I could have typed in Aspatria down here, and I will get exactly the same results. I'll just get back 1 town in Aspatria, or 1 house in Aspatria, and then 7 houses in Maryport. All right, so that's all there is to that. Okay, I'm going to go back and type in Maryport or Aspatria. There we go. And I'm going to add an additional, and so really what we're doing here is we're mixing an OR and an AND query, because remember the AND query, what we can do is we can add, let's say if I was looking for houses in Maryport and houses in Maryport that had 3 bedrooms, that's an example of an AND query. So the query has to satisfy these 2 conditions, Maryport and 3 bedrooms. So if I run this, I only get back 1 result. There's only 1 house in Maryport that has 3 bedrooms. That is an example of an AND query. This condition and this condition have to be met. Whereas in this query, Maryport or Aspatria, either of these 2 conditions can be met, either Maryport or Aspatria. And when I run the query, I get back the relevant records. So that's the difference between the 2. Now I'm going to type in an additional query criteria here under bedrooms. I'm going to type in 3 or 4. So in other words, I'm interested in looking for 3 or 4 bedroomed houses in either Maryport or Aspatria. So if I click run, I only get back 2 records. I only get back a house, 1 house which has 3 bedrooms in Aspatria, and 1 house in Maryport which also has 3 bedrooms. So that's it. That's all there is to OR queries. Now watch out for this. You may be tempted to put 3 and then you might say 4 or 4 down here. Now that's not going to work quite as you think, because if I click run here, I'm going to get back other houses in other towns that also have 4 bedrooms. And the reason for that is It's looking for, yes, 3 or 4 bedrooms in Maryport or Raspatria, but it's also looking for 4 bedrooms, but I have nothing here, so it's going to look for just any town. So watch out for that. In this particular instance, you want to write 3 or 4. So this is going to work with this, okay? And that's a combination of an or and an and query. It's looking for this or this, and it's looking for this or this. So that's all there is to or queries. That's all you're going to have to know. So hopefully that makes sense. I'd encourage you to experiment basically with any of the databases. Try and experiment with some small sets of data so that you can easily test it, and then experiment with both the and the or query, and then experiment with a combination of the two, like we have here. We have 2 of them here. We have 2 or queries, so both of those working together, this and this, will give you a set of results. Yeah, that's it. That's it for the or query. And the very last thing, which is going to be easy to do, I'm going to close this query down without saving it, is you may need to delete a query. They may ask you to delete a query as a question in the exam. Very easy to delete any object. First of all, you have to make sure that the object is not open in question. So if I left click on query by bedroom and press delete, it tells me that I can't delete the database object because the object is open. Query by bedroom, which is this object, is open. So I have to close the object and then delete it. So if I click the X, I can now left click on the query, it's already selected. If I press the delete key, it says, do you want to delete it? Deleting the object will remove it from all groups. We can ignore that. If I click on yes, that's it, it's gone. Now, you can undo that. You can actually undo an object deletion, but obviously you're always better off to make sure that you do want to delete it before you actually delete it. So if I left click on it again, press delete, and then click yes, that's it, it's gone. And that, folks, is the end of the queries chapter. There's quite a bit in it. I apologize for the length of this video. I've tried to make it as short as I can and to make each section as short as I can, but we're done now. So the revision exercises you'll find in the description for this video. You'll see them, just click on the show more link in the description for this video, and you can download. There are only 2 revision exercises for this, driving lesson 63 and driving lesson 64. So download those and experiment, and just experiment in general with them. And as always, if there are any questions about any of the information or material in this video, just drop me a line and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. We're going to move on to our second last section next week. It's going to be forms. It's quite a long one again, I won't lie to you, but as I said, the last 3 sections of this particular module were always going to be long because it's forms, queries and reports. We've done queries now. Forms and reports need to be done. Those are the 3 objects apart from tables. So they're always going to be slightly longer. Nothing too problematic and nothing too difficult in them, more fiddly than anything else. So best of luck with that, folks, and I'll see you in the next video, which will be forms.